Hey,
Beautiful.
everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director of 1455. If this is your first time checking out one of our always free programs, welcome and thank you for joining us. Real quick, 1455, named after the year the Gutenberg printing press started making books. We look back on that as a signal moment in democratizing content. We take our name from that. What we do is we celebrate creativity and storytelling, and whenever possible, we shine a light on storytellers. You can find out a ton more at 1455litarts.org. Check out our events page for links. You can get involved and find out what we have done, what we're going to be doing. One of the things we do is we try to talk to authors with new books out. That's definitely one of my favorite parts of this whole endeavor. And tonight, I am thrilled to welcome back our friend who we have talked to before, Susan Rich, poetess. I've called her a poetic goddess, and I will stand by that. Um, Let me read her bio so you can get a sense, a proper sense of who we're dealing with here and why I'm so visibly giddy to have an opportunity yet again to talk to her. Susan is an extraordinary writer and presence in both the poetic and literary communities. She is the author of 6 books of poetry, including her brand new Blue Atlas. Her books also include Gallery of Postcards and Maps, New and Selected Poems, Cloud Pharmacy, which was shortlisted for the Julie Suk Award, The Alchemist's Kitchen, and others. Her poems have appeared in literally myriad outlets, including, and I'm just going to name a few of the many, Academy of American Poets, Poem a Day, Alaska Quarterly Review, Bennington Review, Gettysburg Review, Harvard Review, O Magazine. You get the picture. Her work has been nominated for several Pushcart Prizes and Best of Net Awards. Her writing has received fellowships from the Artists Trust, Seattle King County, For Culture, the Fulbright Foundation, and Peace Corps writers. You can explore, and you should explore, her writing at poetsusanrich.com. Susan, thank you for being here and joining us again. And without further ado, congratulations on the release of Blue Atlas. What an unbelievable joy it is to spend time with this book.
Thank you so much. It's still kind of brand new. Its birthday was April 2nd. So I'm just in the beginning of the celebration, but it's nice. It was 10 years in the making, 10 years in the writing of it. And then maybe 5 years or 4 years waiting for it to come out. So it's a long journey and I'm giddy that it's out in the world and people can pick it up and read it. It's kind of weird.
And do you happen to have a copy
I
handy?
do.
Please hold it up because I'm failing in my usual job right now. As I told you before we came on, I rushed out to teach today, and my copy's at home. And of course, I have it on my computer because you sent me an ARC, which I started reading, gosh, I think in 2023. So I've really been able to spend some time with this book. But thank you for holding up that beautiful. And I mean, look, there's so much to say. Actually, you know what I should also do? I'll throw a bone rather than me, because I've got plenty of questions to ask. With your indulgence, how about I read what Pulitzer Prize winner Diane Seuss said about your book? That'll be a nice little table setter for our conversation. And again, for those of you watching at home that are about to become big Susan Rich fans, just praise from the Pulitzer Prize winning Diane Seuss. No big deal. This is what she says. The remarkable poems of Blue Atlas chart an expansive life which spins around an epicenter of loss. But loss is too tame of a word, really, for what the speaker bears. Quote, I am a woman swollen with the history of my dead, Rich writes, a body awash in stories. She describes an imperiled childhood and a young adulthood that culminates in a coerced midterm abortion. Blue Atlas exquisitely performs the way trauma, the utter loss of self-determination, of choice, can turn life into seawater, to drift, suspended between deciding and undeciding, from a space outside of the circumstances of longing, where poetry lives. What she said, but I will say as a just an opening salvo, Susan, of course I would lie and say I love this book, but boy, as we said before we came on live, there's never a bad time for personal and political poetry, but I think it's safe to say this is a very opportune time for us to be discussing these poems, the implications in the poet's life, but also in our nation's life. So again, congratulations on a tremendous personal achievement. And I didn't realize it had been 10 years in the writing. So props for that, but also I think for contributing a very vital addition to our discourse, which is sorely needed right now.
Thank you. You're making me think about 2 summers ago when the book was getting ready to be given to Red Hen Press for the final edition. So they took a book 5 years ago and they said, we know you'll change it and you'll add and you'll take away, and that's perfectly fine. And that was such a gift because I just kept working on it. And the book that they took, the book they accepted and the book that they published are dramatically different in poems, in ordering, in lots of different ways. So I was getting together what I expected to be the final manuscript, and I woke up in the morning, and those thoughts that just kind of, they're almost gifts because you're not even awake yet and you have this thought in your head. And the thought was like, oh my goodness, somebody could take this book I've written and make assumptions about my political persuasion, about my beliefs, because as Diane Zeus says in that beautiful quote, she gave me language for this, even though this is something that happened in my life over 30 years ago. It's something that I didn't talk about. And if you don't talk about something, you don't necessarily have language for it. But she said a coerced midterm abortion. And that kind of, like, I just remember where I was sitting. I remember I kind of gasped when she said it. Those are not complex words, but she named something I couldn't really name. So long story short, I do have a poem in here called The Abortion Question. And it is the poem I think of as being maybe the only poem that's really directly political. And it was important to me, even though we could have a whole conversation, what's political, what's not political, the personal is political, but I felt like a lot of these other poems, I'm experimenting, there's lyric, there's movement, and I wanted something that was just very clear on how I stood on this. And I looked into the history of abortion for it as well. So I'm sort of looking at my book, forgive me, to try to see, I haven't read it yet. So it seems like this is the right time with you, if you'll be indulged in it.
Absolutely. And shocker, that was definitely one of the poems that I had earmarked to ask you to read. So thank you.
Sure. And I'll just say before I start, what Diane wrote is a nice intro to the book as well. It gives you the sense that the narrative coheres around a coerced midterm abortion that the speaker had not wanted to have. I'll read the poem and then I'll talk. It's called The Abortion Question. Hold on to your hats because it's 3 pages long with a lot of white space. The abortion question is, did you want it? The abortion question is, did you have a choice? The abortion happened in Manhattan, the Big Apple, shaken and stirred along Madison Avenue, just 2 days after being kicked out of his 5th-floor Paris walk-up. The abortion question watches you through side view mirrors. The self-satisfied gaze like that of an undertaker, as if it holds the answer to the future of your body. The abortion question loves to flirt. It flirts with your sister who accompanies you. Flirt rhymes with skirt, and you relinquish yours for a paper gown. The abortion question laughs with your sister, executor of the plan, who giggles back. But where is the deadbeat non-dad? Is he hiding in the hourglass, the dying tulips? Such a checked out father not to be. The abortion question is bone-tired, multilingual, and global. It looks back on its past, its coat hangers and back alleys, the wild herbs, cotton root bark, and black cohosh. Take a 1/4 cup pennyroyal water, 12 drops hartshorn. wrote Benjamin Franklin in his popular recipe for fixing the misfortune. The abortion question likes the founding mothers best, the midwives, crones, nurses who created an underground network, a Jane collective for the women who fell into trouble, turned suicidal. Abortion is no joke to this body, which ate enough for two. Kosher pickle and chip sandwiches well into the second trimester. The abortion question places its miniature sticks into the cervix, small bundles of twigs made from seaweed. See you tomorrow, the abortion question waves, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. This is not an anti-abortion poem. No one will be killed with a .22 caliber rifle, as in the 2 women's health clinics in my hometown. No one's pushing fetus porn outside the central post office, but the abortion question really loves to attract attention. It lives in a clock tower, chimes strongest at 3 months. Have you heard the one about the United States Supreme Court voting to legislate women's bodies? What a question. The abortion question loves to fool around, masquerading as a lawyer, an illegally appointed judge. It plays swashbuckler, predator, and prey. The question hangs about me like a pest, tugging at my knees, begs, it will not go away, offers another drink, a Manhattan, shaken and stirred.
So thank you for that. I'm curious, Susan, when during the conception of this was that poem written, and was that more of a late stage mic drop, or was that more of a tone setting early, or neither, or a little bit of both?
Certainly it was more late stage. It wasn't the last poem in the book, but I'd put it at the last 5 or 6. It
Okay.
was a draft that I had kind of lying about, that I had just kind of, I've been thinking about how, because this book was difficult to write, it pushed me to try to become a better writer. So I had this draft of this poem that was a couple of years old that I had just, abandoned because it seemed
Right.
too hard. And then I just felt strongly that the book needed something like this. I did a lot of research. The quote about Ben Franklin's recipe for the troubles is completely true. How many people know that the founding father, did these math books so that farmers could learn numeracy as opposed to literacy, but had to be able to use fractions and understand the importance of fractions. And this recipe for aborting a fetus that he called, the troubles, was one of the ways that he was kind of showing that fractions and exact percentages really mattered. And he printed this again and again. It was like a classic.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, there's a whole conversation just in what you just said, in the sense of how a collection comes together, how a poem comes together, and also the immortal, never tired notion of revisiting old work, keep going until you get it right, know when to walk away if it's not going to be right. But I guess I would have no problem saying to you, like, I'm genuinely grateful that this one didn't go away, because I think the collection would still be extraordinary regardless. But there's something very anchoring about that particular poem. And I mean, for me, familiar with your work, familiar with you, that was a moment in the reading of the book where kind of everything stopped, and I really had to kind of control myself, and knew I was going to immediately reread it. It seems like a very important statement within the context of the whole project.
That was one of the things that was interesting about this book. I mean, I've talked with you before about Demystifying the Manuscript, a book that I co-edited with Kelly Russell Agaddon, which is a collection of essays and interviews about how you put a book together. And one of the things I've talked about a lot in that book and in the classes I teach is that you often, at kind of late stage manuscript, realize you might have some holes and that you need to fill those holes if it's a project book, which so is quite common these days. So I also knew that that's hard to do. Like I taught it, and so I've always felt a little hypocritical because I wasn't sure if I had really put it into place. But this poem I've just read is one of those poems where I knew the book needed it. It needed it for me. And I had to write it, even though it felt like it was going to be really difficult. I was just going to the back because there's notes about this poem, and I wanted to see if I put it in. There's a poem by Patricia Lockwood called The Rape Joke that came out, oh, maybe 10 years ago or so. And it's that sort of, I think I borrowed the tone quite a bit. Hers is a rape joke, mine is an abortion question, but personifying this very difficult notion in our culture to try to get at it from different ways. So I thank her for giving me the inspiration through that. And then I also quote the murder of people in the 2 abortion clinics in my hometown, which strangely was happening it was 1996. I was on my way to Gaza and the West Bank, which at that point was a very different place.
Right.
And driving around Eugene, Oregon, where I was living, I was in grad school, and all of a sudden it comes on National Public Radio that these 2 clinics really close to my house, where my dad might have been going for a walk that day, one of them I mean, they were both in my hometown, but one of them was close to my house, was being shot, infiltrated, and people in the waiting room shot and killed. So it stayed in my mind. And that's maybe more than what you asked me, but
Oh.
I think one of the reasons it was a difficult poem to write was because there was so much I wanted to put in it. And I think I ended up cutting it back just a little bit because I didn't want it to keep going and going and going. Although,
It had to be longer than a page, and it could have been. I mean, I think you got what you needed and wanted, and more. And I think that's a great tone setter. Um, so we will circle back inevitably and probably happily on political and the intersection of personal and political. But one thing, it's going to sound almost a little bit like no brainer, but I kept thinking while I was reading this, first of all, the inexhaustible well in poetry of imagery, and that's what makes poetry sing. We can talk all day about how it's difficult to really critique a beginner, to explain to them like why the poem doesn't work, but when you see it done well, it's because you realize there really are only so many words, but it's the way that we use images and words. So I want to talk a little bit or a lot to you about, obviously metaphor is critical in any poetry, but I think for a topic like this, me speaking, I think frankly, a less experienced or less talented poet would be able to thread that needle, but a mature and brilliant poet, I found your command of weaving in very powerfully chosen metaphors and imagery to at once distance and deeply personify some of these experiences and feelings. We get into cliche territory, which we should just dive right into, but it's this notion of it's deeply personal, it's completely universal, and it works, I think, to soothe and comfort readers that have had similar experiences, and it informs readers that have no idea and need to have a better idea. So that's a mouthful, but basically starting with the title, you can, because I was blown away when I read the beginning of the book, and your explanation, but starting with the title and then a poem like this, your use of metaphor and how you went about, picking and choosing.
wow, okay. Well, I'll start with the title because I love titles. I adore them. Although I will say, I mean, when I'm writing a poem and I'm revising, I might go through half a dozen titles easily for the same poem. And once the title clicks, it helps me to work on the poem. I have a better idea of what the poem is directed towards, pointed towards. And a book has somewhere between, 40 and 50 poems. So you get a lot of titles to play with. But when it comes time to do the title of a book, for some reason, I find that much more difficult. The stakes are higher. You only have so many books in a lifetime. And you don't know how many of those are going to be. And you want it to be something evocative and that people will remember, all sorts of things. So this had been called Secret Agent and Spy. I'm not even sure what I was going on about, but I had all these different titles. And when I got to Blue Atlas, it clicked. And it clicked, I have to say, first on an instinctual level. I like, as many poets do, to go at things sideways. I don't, I'm not going to call it the abortion notebooks. That's not my style, although somebody else might.
Right.
Blue Atlas, I mean, I think I wanted something expansive. Sean, as you've just said, it's not just my story, it's everyone's story. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm not trying to write something, I'm not, I don't think of myself as a confessional poet. I do all of these different forms in the book because I'm trying to find different ways to approach this very tough topic. And so Atlas made sense also in a literal sense. We're in Africa, we're in Niger, West Africa, we're in Morocco, we're in France, we're in the US. We move around a lot. And so I wanted that sense of expanse, which is also personal in that it's been my life. And then the color blue, Blue Atlas, it just came to me, which is a weird thing to say, but you're playing with words when you, as a writer, we're all playing with words, but you're specifically playing with words. I wanted an image. Every title that I have on my books, each one of them is an image, with maybe the exception of Cures Include Travel isn't quite as much an image as the rest.
Right.
So I have Blue Atlas, and it's on a list of certain amounts of titles. I think I sent it out to friends, which never tells you very much because your friends always want different things, but it lets you know what your instincts are. And then I Googled it, as we do. I had to make sure that nobody else had the title Blue Atlas. I didn't want to be kind of repeating someone else's title. And that's when I found that the Blue Atlas is the sturdiest, the strongest of the cedar trees, originating in Morocco, but moving around the world. There's a lot of blue cedar where I live in the Pacific Northwest, the strongest tree. And, I'm not a tree expert, which is why it's europeantrees.com is who I quote there, but no flowers, no fruit, and the hardiest, and it can reproduce spontaneously. That really struck me. So I felt like it's this super strong tree. It's absolutely beautiful. It has this ability to be quite independent. And all of that was like, yes. So although I had come up with Blue Atlas not knowing it was a tree, by the time I did my research, I was like, this is such a gift. This is it. And I like the title.
Yeah, and I mean well, I cracked open, I first read it digitally. When I read the explanation of the title, it functioned for me kind of like a great overture. It was like we're already off and running. I haven't read a word of the first poem yet, and we already are there. And the tone has been set. We know we're in the hands of a very intelligent writer, very thoughtful and sensitive. So that's just a slam dunk. And I love that. I won't even call it a happy accident. We also talked a little bit before we came on live about, sometimes things happen and they're gifts from either the muse or the world but the writer, I think the more experienced writer learns to recognize when something important has happened and either makes note of it or just follows it and makes it happen, makes it work.
Yeah. Can I tell the story I told you before we started? And
I insist.
because I think instinct is such a large part of it. I've always believed that if I'm too aware of things, then it's going to become an essay or it's going to become something less magical. And I've been a poet for a really long time because I love the magic of it. And other people might love the scansion. I love the magic. So a lot of things are instinctual. And I love what you said, Sean, that as one's done this for longer, you start to trust those instincts more without having to explain it. So that was true not only of Blue Atlas, it was also true of the cover art. And one of my favorite things about books, once the poems are done, is the whole choosing of cover art. And so far, I've always been given the choice. I mean, the publisher has rights to refuse.
Right.
So I went off on my, as soon as I know that the book's taken, sometimes even before that, I go on my like happy Pinterest pages and start looking for artwork and literally look at thousands of images because I don't know what I want. I know I want color, something that will be eye-catching, but so for this one, let's just cut to the chase. I looked at thousands of images and I have, if you ever want to go on Pinterest, I have a page that probably has 50 to 70 pieces. This was the one that struck me the most. Every time I look at this cover, I have a physical reaction of calm. And I just would look at it on my screen and think, why? I understand that I love the kind of geometry of it, the kind of dissecting line. There's blue pots. Two of those pots have living things in them, greenery. Two pots do not. But it's just this kind of capture of a feeling. So long story short, after some back and forth, Red Hen was gracious enough to let me go with this image. But they said, oh, by the way, you need to have permission from the artist. And as I'm sure you all know, when you go on to Pinterest, it's the Wild West. It's very hard to figure out who was the originator of a piece of art or a photograph. So there was a very long trek through many different missteps to try to find who the real person was, which I'll spare you. But when I got to the real person, whose only social media is LinkedIn, that's the only place he is, Niranj Vandanathan is a man who lives in Bangalore, India, and works for Hewlett Packard. So I found him, and thankfully he had one social media account, and he said, sure, you can have it. You can have it. All I need is one copy of the book, and I'd like credit for the photograph. So I was like, thank you. You're the nicest human being I've ever met, because I've had stories that did not go this way. And we chatted back and forth. I looked up Bangalore in India. I let him know India is a country I've always wanted to visit. And that was months ago, right? Probably last summer. So, we went back to our lives. I'm in Seattle. He's in Bangalore, India. And I just checked in with him less than a month ago. Emailed, hi, Naranj, want to see if you got the book. It's out. It's beautiful. Want to make sure you get your copy. Thank you. And he responded and said, yeah, Red Hen's gotten in touch with me. I don't have it yet, but I will. And he said, funny thing. I think he really did say, funny thing. My office has transferred me for the next 7 weeks to Washington State. I'm living and working in Vancouver, Washington in April and May. And it's 2.5 hours from where I live, 3.5 if there's traffic. So I know that when he was in Bangalore, India, I was like, if you're ever in Seattle, come up and see me. And now it's like, oh my goodness, he is. So he stayed next door. He rented an Airbnb next door to my house. And we just this last weekend had 3 days of my showing him the city, introducing him as the photographer for the work, taking him on a ferry, because that's what you do in Seattle. Took him birding, because that was one of the only things I knew about him, is he was a serious birder. And it was just lovely. We went from being complete strangers, a little awkward, to my having a friend by the end of those days. And that's part of the magic of this book, that I reached out to a complete stranger. If you've ever seen the pictures on LinkedIn, they're smaller than a postage stamp. So I had no idea if this guy was 35 or 65. All I knew was that he had treated me kindly.
I mean, thank you for, I mean, that's so, and it, not only is that a beautiful story, and there's a wonderful kind of full circle symmetry for your book, but I'd like to seize the opportunity to also kind of note that I think, especially in an AI age and just a weird time in publishing, these opportunities to engage with other artists and do multiple things, lift each other up, share community, share audience, give, receive. There's something very nourishing about that. And there's something so organic and authentic about it that that's worthy of celebration. So that story in and of itself is just wonderful. But I think that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned and emulated. I've talked to, as I'm sure you have, Susan, many, many authors who, even with very sympathetic and generous publishers, are not happy with their cover art, aren't happy with the creative direction. So we do live in a time where one thing about technology is it does enable these transactions to occur that 30 years ago would have been unimaginable. So let's focus on how powerful this moment is for us to collaborate and bring different genres together.
Yeah, no, it was lovely. And like I said, I'm skipping over the two artists I've contacted in the past who were like, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you. And it wasn't a matter of money. I think sometimes visual artists don't want to be kind of handmaidens to the words, or they don't want words across their art, or maybe they had a bad poetry situation when they were children. I don't know, but this kind of story, not only was he so kind across the world, but just a generous, lovely guy who, now maybe I will actually get to India and go birding because he's invited me.
I love it. I love it. And that is I will shamelessly shoehorn my segue, but the notion of opportunity for engagement, just opening doors and opportunities. One of the things I wanted to say, and I think this could maybe lead to a couple of other readings from you, is we don't need to, I don't want to, we just don't even really need to go super deep on the political stuff. But what I love about this book, and then art in general, poetry in particular, is that it's so helpful for people to understand that, especially in a very charged political atmosphere where, for a variety of reasons, all of them awful, our political discourse is zero-sum game. People immediately shut down, even on the same side. I think one of the clever ways that art can kind of go in the back door and initiate discourse is art can do what political discourse, even well-intended, can't do, and it's to stimulate response. It stimulate reaction without asking direct questions. And these poems there's a lot of interrogation, rhetorical, the author asking herself, her memory, but it inevitably is leading to the person that's reading this is going to be thinking about current events inevitably. And there's a very powerful tool being used that you wield, delicately but forcefully.
Someone asked me, thank you. Somebody asked me today, which was the most difficult poem to write. And I don't know, and I had two in mind. One of them is a longer poem because I had, like my students often do, I'd started this project and I knew that it was about this abortion, this coerced midterm abortion, but I didn't know how to write about that. And I didn't know if I even wanted to. It started with a lot of angry breakup poems, which I don't even think are in the book anymore, but that was where I started. And then I did what my students do, which is to write around the subject. And so it took quite a while until Post-Abortion Questionnaire, powered by SurveyMonkey, was the first really abortion-focused poem. But I'm not going to read that one. I'm going to read the poem that somebody said to me, a friend, a kind friend, said, you kind of put this a little bit on your sister for her part, which was a big part in what happened. You certainly put something on your ex-fiance, but where are you? And like I said, she said it gently. And I wasn't 14. I was 26. I was a young 26. But she was right. There was some, my sister didn't, take me by force to there. So I thought I would read the poem, The Decision, because this is certainly one of the harder ones. I think of the book as being written in at least 3 different time periods. And so both the abortion question and the decision were in the latter part, the last poems written. The Decision. On my hardest day, I dressed, walked onto the balcony, setting off the system's alarm in the time when only drug dealers and paranoids wrapped their house in radionics, the 80s, days of velour and lycra, hot pants, and Farrah Fawcett hairdos. While I taught high school for Peace Corps in Niger, West Africa, banks installed computers that dispensed dollar bills, asking each of us to type in a secret password. I wanted a word that would open up my life. Grocery stores began using barcodes. How did the silent square know so much? The Walkman appeared, and the mixtape rose in stature. I was a mixtape. Baby or no baby? What was the code that would bring my delinquent fiance home? And the damn bells kept ringing. Keep it, was all I wrote on the postcard. Except this was in French. I'm keeping myself, was what I said. And I posted the fragmented blues and fiery reds to his last known Paris address. I'm keeping it, I said, as I let the wailing in my brain, the alarm now inside and outside the apartment. Then the body, no longer my body, but a cathedral of past seductions, seemed to disappear. And so I did what was asked for. I headed towards the abortion doctor and strolled off the balcony into the land of the dead.
It's like a
So that,
freight train of emotion and feeling and lived memory, rendered, with tenderness and accountability. It's all in there, Susan. That it's all in there.
thank you. It's a hard poem to read. And like I said, one of the harder ones to write because it was, taking the accountability and the complexity. And, when I think of this time now, it feels almost like a different person because it was so long ago. And I just have great empathy for this young woman who really had so few choices, nobody to turn to. I have one more story I want to tell, and then you can ask me anything you want. But
Oh, keep going.
I did my graduate work in poetry in the 90s after Peace Corps, after this had all happened. I think it was probably 10 years later. And the poet Garrett Hongo was my thesis advisor. And I know he had us come into his office for like a last meeting before we went off into the world after all of our, papers were due. And I don't remember the conversation I had with him because it seems so unlikely that I would have told him about this abortion, but I must have. He must have somehow asked me something that got us onto this subject. Not because he wasn't kind, but because I'm a fairly private person, or at least I used to be. But I remember telling him enough so that he looked at me and he said, "That's the book you need to write." And I looked back at him as if he had gone insane, absolutely insane. Why would I take the most difficult time of my life and place it in on paper in a book, spend any time with it, show it to anyone? It didn't make any sense. And my face must have given off a little bit of that, even though I was too polite to tell him he was insane. And he said, the reason is because it's not only your story. You don't own it. And that it made enough sense to me that like 30 years later, or 20, however many years it's been, I still remember it. But it's taken me all this time for enough distance to go from that young woman who had so few options, for me to become a poet who had more expertise to write these poems that I could not have done in the 90s. So I'm still in touch with them. Like, hey, I don't know if you remember this thing you said to me, but guess what? I finally took your advice.
And you were able to tell him that?
I've written that to him. Yeah, I
That's
have.
so gratifying. I need to try to contain myself because what you just said got me so excited. There were so many different ways we could go, but suffice it to say, this is what we call a teaching moment. There's so much wisdom that you just dispensed there, Susan. one of the things, because I feel like this has come up in so many conversations I've had, and I'd be shocked if you haven't had many of your own as a teacher, poet, just as a person. But this whole notion, especially when more kind of younger or aspiring writers are like, but this is what happened and I need to write about it. And the answer is always yes. And it might be very good, it might be very emotional, it might be very moving. But there are certain pieces that we need to have some distance from. For a variety of obvious reasons. I think that really holds true with memoir, but even with poetry, and I've written this in the margins of my notebook when I was reading your collection, which was, and I wasn't trying to be too cute, but I was like, these are poems a man couldn't write. These are poems many women couldn't write. These are poems many women that have had abortions couldn't write. And so, yeah, is that too cute? Well, yeah, of course, because everyone's individual. But what I was thinking over and over again was, these are probably radically different in very good ways than what you would have written 20, 25 years ago. And I'm certain what you would have written 20 years ago would have been devastating and wonderful. But with your maturity as a writer and a woman, and having the understanding of how to shift time frames and how to shift mood and how to weave in history and fact and personal, there's so much expertise. It's what we talk about, whether it's athletics or art. You want to make it look easy, but we all know it's not very easy to do.
Right. And, AWP has panels on everything. And I don't know if I'm going to do this, but I really feel like I want to introduce a panel for next year, the book you never wanted to write. And that's exactly how I feel about this. And, obviously I did write it. I put my name on it. There's things about it that I'm quite happy with, but it's not an experience that I wanted to have. And I'll just tell you again, I like telling stories and I love talking to you. The book was in the world at AWP, and so I got copies shortly after that. And probably a month ago, I gave a copy to my friend Christy, who lives nearby. So I think she got the first copy that I gave out. And no big deal. We went for a walk, we had dinner, we went home to our separate houses. And that night she texted me and she just said how moved she was by the work. And she kind of, sort of referenced a few things. And I was shocked, not because she liked it or she's a good friend and she's saying kind things. I was shocked because I had never gotten to the point of thinking, oh, people are going to read these poems. I got to the point that I would write them. I wanted them to be in a book. I was so happy to have Red Hen as my publisher, but I hadn't really thought through that people would now know this part of my life that for years I never talked about. And even though this was a very dear, close, loving friend, it was a shock. Like, you're reading that poem? Like, you're just supposed to put the book on your shelf.
Well, look, another teaching moment, inevitably. I think, Susan, we can both chuckle, but I think there's a lot of truth to this. I think what we suffer from, and maybe it's always been thus, those that are certain that they should share their most intimate personal details seldom have the ability to pull it off with aplomb. And those that are circumspect usually have the thoughtfulness and the wisdom and the maturity to be circumspect, and then good art can come out of that. So whether it sounds patronizing or not, I can tell you with complete sincerity, I think in addition to just the poems speak for themselves, they're on a craft level, chef's kiss, but this is a very brave book. I think it's a very generous book because, as we both have already said, this is a woman's story that, by the way, maybe in 2024, men should even read it first. But the point being, this is something that you can share that is going to comfort people. It's going to enlighten people. And yeah, you're putting yourself out there in all the really risky ways. I find it an extraordinary act of bravery. So that should be acknowledged and appreciated.
Thank you. I did read the abortion question at AWP. I think I had a 5-minute reading as part of the Red Hen Press event. And 3 of my friends from grad school, these 3 guys, Brian Turner, Tim Maxwell, and Ted O'Connell, all showed up to cheer me on, which was super sweet. So, I mean, it's not like I see them all the time, but they all wanted to be there for me. And afterwards, they were all like, that poem, the abortion question, everybody in the room. And these are 3, middle-aged white guys, everybody in the room. was silent, thinking about their relationship to an abortion that, they had had, or their girlfriend or lover, or someone they knew. And it was just really striking to me that these three, like I said, three guys were so taken with that poem. That's the one that they were moved by. That's the one that got them to think about their own lives. And so, like I keep saying, a lot of this was sort of an instinctual level, and I had so many years with it. I'm glad I did. It took a long time to get into the form it's in now. I think I was thinking, wait, I've written a book, I've co-edited a book on ordering poems. I got to get this order right. And I got the order fine. I mean, I'm sure it could have been done different ways, but I'm pleased, especially with the first three sections and the way that it moves.
No, I think it's great. And in fact, two things. So one of the, and I have it, I see it now. I was referring from memory, but here's the poem that I actually wrote that about. And maybe if you want to read it, I wrote, a man could never write this. Any woman cannot necessarily write this. Even a woman with an abortion wouldn't necessarily write this. And it was about binocular vision.
Oh,
Page
okay.
80. So yes is a request, but if you want to read something else, by all means. But that was the poem that I actually wrote those words thinking like, this is where we're getting into artistry and Susan's vision, that this is what we celebrate. Like, yeah, this is a great poem, full stop. But like, you want to know about the poet and what's her unique style? What is her unique skill set? Here's an example.
Thank you. I'm more than pleased to read this for you. Binocular vision. What happens to a zygote who never becomes? No cartilage to deliver back to the ground, no evening meals for the earthworms, no morning glory. Today is your happy non-birthday, 31. Perhaps you would have developed into a geologist or a lounge singer, keen observer of the disappearing life. I imagine you the way politicians often fantasize about their voters, illogically and with a little greed. I had you and then suddenly didn't have you. My insides retracted by mother, father, sisters, us two against four. And I folded to forever or to that ongoing number, infinity, where we balance on bitter ovals of regret. My spy in the afterlife, my choiceless choice, like a suicide's last wish to disappear by deep water or blood-splashed bracelets, immolation or implosion of the heart. Don't I transform by that same double hinge, half mother, half old crone, longing for my lovely, disembodied, my dear body of a boy.
So thank you so much for reading that for me, for us. Look, I just, that's the kind of poem that I would read, on the internet or in a book and just be like, I want to share that with everyone. But boy, would it be so cool to know who wrote this. And this is a rare example in life of, I know this person and consider her a friend and I'm a fan. What a great honor. So I just want to kind of acknowledge the moment that this is so deeply gratifying for me to have an opportunity to hear a poet I greatly admire and learn from reading her work in real time. It's just extraordinary. I'm so happy right now, even though this is really somber stuff. It's like, this is what we do. This is what we talk about. This is how we bear witness. And I had written down another one that's maybe too cute by half, but I had written, work like this is an empathy generator. This is an empathy machine where no one can read poems like this and be unchanged. Doesn't mean you're going to change your political affiliation. Doesn't mean you're going to start writing or reading poetry, but you cannot be unmoved in some way by work this affecting. And that it is a significant achievement.
Thank you so much. Um, the book is still new, as I said, and so I'm learning what this is as a book. And I haven't read this poem as part of the book before, and I haven't read it in ages. So it feels kind of like, oh my goodness. It was a big one to write in that terms of just kind of addressing this child that I didn't actually get to have. And it's just interesting to see where people gravitate towards, what poems they choose, what they tell me about the book. And I'm grateful. It's kind of a special moment to be doing a lot right now with it being brand new. It all feels like, okay, I know I wrote this book, but that was a while ago. And what moved you? What was the poem that you were interested in? What's the poem that you want to go back to? I'm much more interested in what readers are finding here. So thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Of course. If you're in the giving mood, I have another request.
Please,
Well, and
absolutely.
here, one of the things I loved about this, because it came toward the end, and again, for me anyway, I'd like to think I was not the most unsophisticated reader of this material, but
I'm sure you're not.
it didn't need uplift because I found it to be, very roller coaster. Like, of course, there's, this is a heavy subject, but it's not morose. This isn't depressing, but nevertheless, there were a series of poems toward the end that were almost, what's the word, like very affirming, very powerful, and very celebratory of women, if I may say. And the poem Abeyance, page 102. Here's what I wrote in the margin. This is a whole memoir, a movie. Wow.
I don't know if you know the fiction writer and poet Lisa Taylor. She lives now in Colorado, but we share a friend. We share an Irish friend, and we share a love of Ireland. And this is actually a story she told me. She was visiting Seattle. It was the first time I think I met her, or maybe the second. And this is the story of what happened to her daughter. So her daughter's been immemorialized in this poem without my ever having met her daughter. So anyway, I'll read it if you'd like, for sure.
Hey.
Abeyance. Today, my friend told me of her girl's hand-dug coffin, how in Antarctica, training to stay alive meant to pickaxe, crack, and cut until a furrow the size of a brown bear appears, and her graduate school daughter descends into a trench barely lengthwise enough for her sleeping sack, eventually sealed off with a brick of snow. An ice coffin, the mother told me gently, recalling how her offspring slipped beneath the crust of the world, how the hours spent warming hands in armpits was worth it. To survive, the woman relied on her own muscle work, a lacy box of molecules, and the animal beat of her heart. At dusk, with the exercise completed, the men disappeared to hot showers, a dinner of ribs in the ranger station. But her daughter remained underground. She had labored for hours and was determined to sleep beneath the ice. And then suddenly, the next morning, as she climbed up, solidly alive, stunned by the machinery of her own body, I like to believe she knew herself as different, changed as Persephone had changed into a new woman, lifted into a blue abeyance, beyond the self and climbing.
I can't tell you how much I love that poem, and all that's going on there. But what I take away from that is this just unbelievable just positivity. There's probably what's a better word, because that sounds too cheap. Like everything about that is affirming, unflinching, and look, that a poem like that could be written about a son, and it would be very similar, but for me, there's something, the fact that it's a woman and all the guys go and eat, I love it. I love it.
Thank you. It was kind of fun to write, but I think I felt a little bit of an imposter because I don't think I have it in me to ever do something like that. And I was so awed by it. And really, it was a conversation over a Sunday brunch with someone I hardly knew. But and I don't usually, I'm not one of these poets who writes from anything at any time. But there was something about the ice and the woman doing this thing that no one else did. And my kind of love of that landscape, even though I don't know that I'll ever get there. Um, so thank you. Thank you so much. I think it was a poem where it's like, does this fit? But as you said, towards the end, there's a lot of life affirming poems, and it fit in that respect for sure. And you don't have to know it was my friend's daughter. It's
Right.
a young woman who's doing this thing.
And listen, so yes to all of that. I guess I'll gently and lovingly push back and say, look, of course we must write from the heart and write not what we know, but we need to have an authentic perception, I think, for work to resonate. But I think what that poem does, which I would defend, vociferously, is you heard a story, you saw the metaphor, and you developed it beautifully so that there's a difference between elevating someone's story to poetry and then just writing it as a Facebook post. So I actually want to carve out space. You're being very modest. I think what you did there was actually very extraordinary. You elevated what's already a really cool story and took it to a whole other place. And I would imagine anyone, the young woman in question would be thrilled the way you memorialize that. But even if she or anyone else didn't, I certainly think I'm not going to be the only reader that reads that and feels this tremendous sense of kind of infused power and purpose and a real celebration of what we are as human. We're fallible. We need to survive. We need to cultivate skills to do so. It's laden with metaphor, but it also, never mind metaphor, it's pretty transparent exactly what's going on.
Cool. Well, thank you. And I love the idea of it sort of as a film and that I teach film. I haven't met Lisa's daughter, but I think I'm going to be going out to Colorado to do some readings. And we corresponded a bit. She seemed to be happy enough with it. That's always the danger when it's a real person. And of course, I took all sorts of liberties with it. I don't know that the men went to eat ribs, but they did in my version of it.
If what is the expression? If the myth is better, print the myth. Like, yeah, we writers need to take some liberties in the service of, and I mean that happens quite often. My wife will read certain poems and be like, "Was it Kmart or was it?" It's like, trust me, for the flow of the words, like the story's true, and that sounded better. So that could be a whole another hour just talking about like with it, and I think at least mature readers and writers recognize masters at work. Like the literal truth, that does not inoculate you from bad writing. I think we all learned that in workshop, right? When we're in our college days, like the defense of, but this is exactly as it happened. It's like, yeah, and that's not art. that's a story. Um, so yeah, please allow me to indulge you very sincerely with what you're doing there is taking raw material and really transforming it into something that is not only more beautiful through words, but again, I think is something people are going to cling to as a very empowering sentiment.
Well, thank you. I'll take it. I think I'm just curious, and we could do a whole hour on this, why sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes you hear something, and I'm sure I jotted down a few notes at the time just so that I wouldn't forget, put it by my bedside table, and then at some point, hopefully before too much time went by, tried to dig in a bit more. But there's so many amazing things that we have friends tell us each day or we read that never get developed that way. So it's just curious to me, of all the things that kind of go on in our lives, which are the ones that we um, are somehow, and I keep going back to instinctually drawn to in ways that we don't completely understand. Because if we understood it, we would never have to write a poem about it. I'm writing a poem as an inquiry. I'm writing a poem to sort of understand something about this mythic young woman who's doing something that I don't think I'd ever be brave enough to do, but that's part of the allure. And I suppose I'm saying all this because I wish I knew how to coax that a bit more so that there'd be more experiences when someone tells me something amazing that I could somehow create art from. But I think that's why when it does happen,
Yeah.
it's so incredibly alchemical. Yeah.
Yes, well, you correctly said we could jump down that rabbit hole. Maybe we'll save that for our next conversation. But in brief, I definitely have opinions about that. I think, when the younger writer, and I think it's Hemingway, but it doesn't matter who first said it, but the younger writer first has to develop that bullshit detector and understand why cliche doesn't work. And if you've heard it before, then you should do a different thing. But I think as writers mature, we really, our antennae become much more sensitive and perceptive. And I think we instinctively, I like that you use that word, I think we instinctively and intentionally are picking up the radar system. And even if we're not really cognizant, when something hits, there's some part of us, an impulse that's like makes note of that. I mean, there's obviously the nuggets that are dropped, and one drops everything and jots that down. But I'm talking about, I do think that there's more intention there, but I'd like to think that the more mature writer has cultivated this skill set of being an avid listener and just being open to, I could be watching a basketball game and something the commentator says is a doorway into a whole. I don't think those things happen by accident, but I think what you're also talking about is kind of that mystical humility of like, I don't know where this comes from. There's beauty in that too.
I'm going to try to be more open. I'm about to go traveling back home to Boston and seeing my English teachers from high school who are coming to this reading I'm doing. And traveling is one of the ways that I think I get out of my own worries and concerns more. And hopefully there'll be some poems that come along. I'm open to it.
I don't see how there couldn't be. And that was another thing I don't even think we need to touch on, but I think it suffices to say, in all of your poetry and in this collection, what we have, which is, I think, what immediately separates work, when we see people that are either navel gazing or are writing very imaginatively about things that they probably don't have a deep connection to, somehow it just doesn't resonate. And what we get from all of your work, Susan, is a woman that is well read, deeply experienced, and deeply traveled. And those different touch points and touchstones of experience are constantly filtering through the work. And I think that there's a depth that informs both the feeling and the metaphors.
Mm. Thank you. I feel like I need to, like, all these lovely things you're saying, I'm going to print them out and put them above my desk for all the doubt that I have and all the times when I think, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know. Have I figured out how to write a poem yet? I'll be, well, Sean thinks I have. So, and that's the other part, having community, right? Having people who are like, oh, this poem fits into your collection. And I'm thinking, oh, it does? How does that happen? But I'm very blessed, lucky, excited, happy to have a great community of writers in the Northwest, in the Seattle area, who we share work, we talk about our work, and it just is very gratifying. The idea of sitting alone in my garret and just trying very hard to squeeze one poem out of my small brain is an anachronism if it ever existed. So I just want to do a shout out that I'm part of a community of poets and how much that has helped me through the years.
Yeah, and I'll say this, when I do my write up on this, I will include links. But folks, those of you that are listening and like, God, Susan's amazing. Good news. She's got stuff online, but even if you just go to the 1455 archives, we have talked a little bit more about community. We will talk again, and I'm sure we will inevitably go a little bit deeper on community. But that's a great note to end this conversation, that Susan and I is not our first rodeo. I will put the links in so you can see what we've talked about in the past. But for today, yes, put those words above your desk. You're an ardent fan. But But listen, I mean, I said it at the outset, and I say it again. Yes, you're a friend. Yes, you're a compatriot. But it's wonderful to be able to say I am a fan of your work, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to have the pleasure of discussing it with you and having you read it. And it's the least I can do to shine that light as brightly as I can and say, hey, folks, check this out. This will change your life.
Thank you so much. And right back at you. I loved your book, which I recently blurbed that you have out this year. So let's not forget that. And
Yeah.
also, I wanted to say we've actually never met. That's one of the bizarre things about the internet. We were introduced to each other through an anthology that I was part of during COVID,
Yep.
right? It was Alone Together, I believe was
Right.
what it was.
Yep.
So at some point we'll meet, and hopefully, I met someone recently. I'm like, oh, you're shorter than I thought. I didn't say that to the person, but we don't have like physical bodies to go along with each other. We just have this idea that we're simpatico in ways of looking at the literary world and in our work. So thank you. So you're my friend who I have yet to meet.
Yeah, well, to be continued, obviously. That's always how I end these conversations. But and I mean, I always mean it, but let's just as you know, that you I think there will be ample opportunities for our paths to cross, and I can't wait. But yeah, today it was great to focus. And do me a favor, because normally this is where I hold up the book. Susan Rich, author of Blue Atlas. Folks, I mean, what more can I say? I can say more, and I probably will say more later, but I mean, if you're not convinced, just get on there, get a copy, buy a copy for a friend, buy a copy for an undecided voter. The world needs to read this book. And again, what a great opportunity. So, Susan, congratulations. Thank you again for being here, and enjoy this ongoing journey as you introduce this book to the world. I'm going to read it out so people can, and again, I'll put this in the link when I do my write-up, but poetsusanrich.com, check her out, buy the books, follow her journey. She'll be documenting these upcoming readings, and we will see you soon, my friend. This will be to be continued for sure.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been a total pleasure. Total pleasure.
Likewise, congratulations, be well, and I can't wait to see where you end up in the next couple of weeks on these readings.
All right. Take good care.
You too. Bye.